Bob Murphy Show, episode 409.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I am going to be interviewing Terry Hulsey, who is the author of The Constitution of Non-State Government, Field Guide to Texas Secession. And let me just read, the book is in the Mises Institute bookstore. It's not published by them, but it's in their bookstore. And here are some blurbs endorsing it. So Walter Block says, "This is a tremendous achievement." David Gordon says, "An impressive achievement. It is excellent and the product of careful thought and much learning." And Dr. Donald Livingston says, "It is a splendid study written in a clear and spirited style. I especially like the effort you made to show how concretely Texas or some other state could gradually transition into your non-state republic." And Dr. David Upham says, "An impressive achievement, a banquet of reflections and insights." So I say all that because it's going to come out of left field here that Terry has put a lot of thought into this matter, and he's got a separate structure or framework, and it's not identical to, for example, the Rothbardian framework. All right, and we touch on that at the end of the discussion, where I ask him to contrast his worldview with a Rothbardian ANCAP approach, because Terry is familiar with that. And he talks about it in the book. All right, so anyway, I just wanted to give you that background to know that serious thinkers that many of the listeners of the Bob Murphy Show probably esteem or respect have said that this guy is someone to be grappled with, and they like the achievement he's performed in this book. So, other than that, I think we set out from the get-go with Terry, what we're going to do in the episode, so I don't need to give you a further introduction. Here is my discussion on the problems with the form of government that was handed down since 1648, and what can we do instead of that model. Here's my discussion with TL or Terry Hulsey. Terry, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thank you, Robert. Good to be here.
So, folks, as I would have alluded to in the introduction already, we are here discussing The Constitution of Non-State Government, Field Guide to Texas Secession, second edition by T.L. Hulsey. And so, Terry, I know that for the purposes of our conversation here, you've distilled things down to 5 points. Do you have those in front of you, or do you want me to read the 5 points?
I've got them. I've got them right here.
Yes. So why don't you go ahead and make your statement, and then we can just jump right in.
Okay, Robert, I make bold claims, and I'm relying on you and your listeners to put these through the ringer to verify these claims. So the first point is that just as a subjective theory of value provides the basis for objectivity in economic science, especially the Austrian sense of it, I claim also this subjective theory of value to create a fifth praxeological category, which I call architectonics. I claim that by this, no government can enforce any universal set of ethical values. Ethical values are provisionally, contingently, and contextually enforced in a small community without any claim to universality. We can go back and unpack that, or I can go to the second point.
Yeah, but maybe go through all the points, and then we'll circle back and just hit them in turn.
Okay, I'll go quickly through the remaining 4. I claim in the second point that all majoritarian elective schemes must result in oligarchic government tyranny. Now, the only mechanism to produce democratic government is through unstratified sortition. Third, I claim that secession is the right of association writ large and is the only peaceful ultimate assertion of right to democratic government. Fourth, I claim that the state form of government, otherwise known as the liberal state or the European state, which was created in 1648, that form of government must result in totalitarianism because it attempts to enforce a universal set of ethical values, because its legitimacy is based in majoritarian electoral politics, and because it denies the right to secession. And finally, fifth point, I claim that democratic principles can only be realized in what I call a kleristocratic government, from the Greek word kleros, election by lot, inspired by the symbiotic subsidiarity principles of Johannes Althusius, died 1638.
Okay, great. So the reason I wanted you to go through all those, Terry, was so people could see, like particularly in the fourth point, you're sort of relying on the groundwork you've laid in the earlier ones. And so like if someone grants you the first through third, the fourth is kind of like a, therefore. And so that's partly why I want just people to see where you're going with this so they can recognize what happens if they don't dig their heels in early on and to see where you're taking them with all this.
Okay, we're trying to hook them early.
Yes. Okay, so let's circle back then. So this first point, again, you're saying the subjective theory of value provides the basis for objectivity economic science. That my listeners are probably going to be fine with that claim. And it's good to point that out, that George Reisman, for example, got upset about, he didn't like the subjective theory of value because he was coming from a Randian perspective and so he believed in objectivism. And the point is that, no, it's objectives. Praxeology is objective. We're just saying people have, you know this. I'm just clarifying.
So you have to clarify that every time. Yes, go on.
Okay, and so now you're saying, let's talk about architectonics. So again, you're saying no government can enforce any universal set of ethical values. Ethical values are provisionally, contingently, and contextually enforced in a small community without any claim to universality. So how do you want, is it first easier to show the first thing, that this universal claim like that can't work?
Well, we'll touch that, but let me back up a little bit about the business of subjective theory of value.
Sure.
I take from a 1950s article by an Austrian economist that there are four categories of praxeology. That's Crusoe economics, catalactics, which is simply market economics, war theory, and game theory. And I propose a fifth one, and that is what I think should have been proposed all along, based on the subjective theory of value, and that is this, what I call architectonics. Now, just to back up a little bit about the subjective theory of value, especially as used in catalactics or market economics, as you point out, that doesn't mean anything non-rational. For example, the man driving down the road comes to a stop sign. He can go straight, he can turn right, and say he turns right. So you can ask all of these moral and essentially, from an economic perspective or an Austrian perspective, irrelevant questions. Well, did he not go straight to delay going to a bad dinner prepared for him by his wife? Or did he turn right to go to the ice cream stand? Or did he not really like ice cream and he wanted to patronize this store because it was run by minorities? All of that is irrelevant. So you ask yourself, well, what does that really get you? You can say that almost any action in that sense is abstractly rational. Basically, Mises starts with a Kantian category, synthetic a priori category, which is the foundation for him for economics. Well, what is this? What good is this? Well, to me, it provides a foundation that really can eliminate any positive account of rights. It can eliminate any need for reference to natural law. So it does all these things without having to. It's like cutting through a Gordian knot, allowing this foundation to be built without trying to make any justification in morality or law or natural law or any other means of providing a foundation. Similarly, I do the same thing, or try to do the same thing, in my fifth category of praxeology, which I'm calling architectonics. And I make the claim that it is impossible for government to provide universal set of values. And that has been the entire project of the Enlightenment, to provide a universal foundation for government. And this began essentially in the creation of the modern European, or what you might call, or better call, the Westphalian state, which was created in 1648.
And that's the Treaty of Westphalia, or the Peace of Westphalia, like the end of the 30 Years' War, stuff people might vaguely remember. Yeah,
exactly right. So actually, that treaty was created by an astonishing group of people. It was by what I call proto-intellectuals. Of course, real intellectuals didn't come about until the French Revolution, but a group of scholars got together. Of course, they were trained in the church, but they were not clerics and they were not statesmen. They were independent thinkers who tried to resolve this crisis of the late 16th century, where they realized that society was threatened by fratricidal religious war. And also, incidentally, the Muslims were just 100 miles east of Vienna at this time. So they had to act. And what they did was create this, they created the modern state. And it was based on sovereignty and an absolute sense of sovereignty by the reigning authority of the state. Now, in the past, this legitimacy and authority was derived from the church and from heredity, and that was cast aside. So what was the legitimizing foundation for the state? It turned out to be democracy, especially in the late 18th century. And the trouble with democracy is it's a double-edged sword. It claims to represent the people, but at the same time, there are factions within that democratic mass that can rise up and, using that same ideology, cast that government out the window. So that's where we are now. And probably my first assertion should have been, my first claim, is that we are faced in the moment with the dissolution, with the breakup of the Westphalian state. Mm-hmm. And as far as my reading tells me, there is no other comprehensive alternative offered other than mine to replace the failed European or Westphalian state. So that you may say, for example, that.
Well, can I just ask you, Terry, just to clarify? So it's interesting because on the one hand, it's like one of the principles that I take that you're saying is they sort of recognize that, oh yes, each state is sovereign within its jurisdiction, but yet you're also saying they also had this backdrop of some kind of universalism. So is it like saying we all universally agree on that, on what like the modern nation state is? Or what? Yes. Do you see the tension there, or the interesting juxtaposition of two different approaches?
Well, even the sovereign states are not exclusively sovereign. There is a universality overriding it, especially during the Enlightenment. There was this attempt to universalize all of this government. And you may say, for example, well, we can all agree that a government should suppress violence, right? Can't we universalize that? I mean, that's about as basic as you can get.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you can't do it because we have, in the present day, a complete repudiation of that notion in the comparison of the treatment by the government of the 2022 summer of riots versus the January 6 riots. The administration punitively punished, severely punished the January 6 rioters, while at the same time, under its administration, went leniently on those who rioted during the summer of 2022. And also, too, there's the Biden administration allowed in 12 million illegal immigrants under its watch to create a total of some 20 million illegal immigrants in the United States. And although they're not, as immigrants are not, they're not inherently lawbreakers, and yet there were ample evidence that among this mass were very violent people. And yet the Biden administration completely ignored the violence of those who came in under its watch. So you can say, well, the police function can be universalized, and yet it can't. It depends on the administration as to which group is treated leniently or severely. So to consider another aspect of this, what I consider to be a departure from this principle of universality, I followed very strongly. I was very powerfully influenced by Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume that's familiar with you, reading this.
Yeah.
But anyway, his whole point is that you cannot have a deontological system of ethics. His approach is to return to Aristotle and have for his standard of morality the ideal of excellence, which can only be a local excellence. So that goes hand in hand with the society that I'm envisioning. So I don't know if we've exhausted point one, or if you have other questions about it.
Well, just in the interest of time, because I could keep talking about this is great stuff, but I think probably we should move on, and then we can, as you link these concepts together, we can maybe clarify any confusion. So yeah, why don't we? The second point again is, I claim that all majoritarian elective schemes must result in oligarchic government tyranny, and the only mechanism to produce democratic government is unstratified sortition. So for one thing, what do you mean by unstratified sortition? What does that mean?
Okay, yeah, there's quite a bit to unpack there. Sortition in the Athenian sense is completely different from the use made of it in the last 15 years. There have been several stratified sortitions in Britain, France, Ireland, and in other places. But by stratified, I mean that subgroups are guaranteed within the otherwise totally random selection of people to perform a function of government. And by the way, the current use of sortition doesn't install a government or any legislative body through its mechanism. It's always, or at least in the current use of it, has been to decide some important pressing question. For example, same-sex marriage or abortion. Both of those were considered in the Irish sortition. But the thing is that these stratifications, which are made on the basis of race, age, or wealth or rural versus urban. All of these are completely arbitrary. For example, in the case where Brett Henning performed the UK sortition, he allowed people who claimed to be women, that is transgender people, to to enter the lottery as women. So in that case, if that's the case, then why not have that same standard for people who want themselves considered as rich or poor in order to get themselves or to affect the sortition? And this whole process.
Hey, Terry, let me just make sure we're not losing. So when you say you mean the government officials are just randomly selected? Is that what that means? For people
Well,
who
once
just
again,
don't...
yeah, once again, it's not officials. It's, in the current sense, not been used for the selection of even a legislature. So it's to pick a body, typically about 100 people, out of the great mass of people from, say, Ireland, Britain, or France, to decide this important current issue, such as abortion or something else. So, yeah, you would think that their appeal to the standard of the law of large numbers would obviate the need for this kind of stratification. But once they go into the business of creating these guaranteed strata, for example, we're going to make sure that there are this percentage of women, this percentage of blacks, this percentage of Hispanics, and so on, then the result is a foregone conclusion. In every case, there have been about a dozen of these sortitions in the last 15 years. And in every case, the result favors the left version or the state-sponsored version. So, for example, in Ireland, abortion was approved by this method, and same-sex marriage was approved by this method, and so on through the rest in Britain and France for these same issues. So,
Terry, I just know, because I think I know what you're talking about, but can you, just for people who do have no clue, what do you mean when you say sortition was used to decide same-sex marriage abroad? Like, what is, because here it's like, oh, the Supreme Court ruled on it, but what do you mean when you say sortition was used for people, that Americans who just, all we know about is what happens in the U.S.?
Very good. So, okay, in the case for Britain and UK, Britain and Ireland and France, it was not presented as a legal challenge or a Supreme Court decision. It was presented as a novelty, actually, to allow the people to decide. So these various organizations, Brett Henning has his own special organization in the UK, were formed to manage that, what would otherwise be a random selection. They could have said, I suppose, presented the entire issue as a referendum to the entire nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they did not want to do it that way. The whole issue of modern sortition is to guarantee the representation. And there's the whole sticking point right there. Representation is totally incompatible with random selection. So if you want this representation, as all these cases did, then you have to guarantee that certain strata of the otherwise random mass are given a vote. And that, as I say, guarantees, or did at least in these cases that occurred in the last 15 years, guaranteed a leftist result. So
can I just ask, so the logic is this, that if you just had a full-on referendum, like literal majority rule, then the majority would get their way, and then there could be the concern is there could be minority groups that aren't represented, and they always get overruled. And so they say, okay, so rather than just having it a straight out vote, why don't we construct a smaller sample where we go make sure we grab relevant people or stakeholders or whatever the term is they want to use and plug them in. And then, go figure that the group that's in charge of picking the subgroup that gets to go do the vote is the one that, they end up voting the way that, the power structure wanted it to be the outcome.
You stated it precisely. That's exactly it. Otherwise, if you do just have a, barefaced or straight on referendum, then some people won't vote. They don't care to vote. They're apathetic. Especially minority groups, they're not, I wouldn't say apathetic, but less inclined to show up at the polls. So to overcome those problems, and especially the business of apathy, was really a problem in the UK referenda. And Brett Hanning, the manager of this thing, admitted to tweaking these strata to make sure that people got to the polls that would otherwise generally not go.
Okay, so I think people get now that you're saying, so yeah, you rely on unstratified sortition, or that's really the only way you can hope for it. And if not, if you're just relying on majoritarian elective schemes, that the oligarchy is going to get its way. Is that a fair summary of what you're doing in point 2?
That's exactly right. And it might be noted that in Athens, this business of random selection of not issues at all, but real enduring administrative posts was used for every branch of government, every type of position, judges, administrators, except for one case, and that is the strategos, the general in charge of the military, was not chosen by lot, but everybody else, they got just a random picking. Actually,
I guess I was going to say the only analog I can think of that in U.S. society today would be like jury duty.
Yes, indeed. In fact, they sometimes call these pools jury pools, but of course, you're talking about the Smithy case, and they're applying it to these other cases.
Okay, great. I think we got a handle on that now. And again, just the interest of time, because there's so much more of your book that I want to get into. So, third point, I claim that secession is the right of association writ large and is the only peaceful, ultimate assertion of right to democratic government. So can you unpack that?
Sure. Mostly this was inspired by Donald Livingston's claim that secession was the very essence of Jeffersonian America. He points out, and you can find these several videos of his online, that Jeffersonians realized that once society got too big, it was unmanageable in a democratic sense. And these founders were serious students of especially the Swiss experiment, the canton system in Switzerland. In fact, James Madison, before the convention debates, locked himself up in a room with a stack of books, studying all of this stuff, and realized that the canton system was an inspiration for what he eventually came up to be federalism. So, as Livingston points out, Jeffersonians expected there to be secession. For example, all of the seaboard colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, as they expanded westward, they seceded, or ceded if you want to be nitpicky about it. They split off their sovereignty into new states, and, expecting that to happen, not as if it were some accident. According to him, it was the American way of doing things. And also, too, it's the international way of doing things. If you count the number of states in the United Nations at the end of the Second World War, it was about 54. And now they're almost 200. So there's a fourfold increase in nations in the world. And how did they get there? Unless there were secessions, many secessions happening.
Right.
And
it wasn't people were finding tracts of land that nobody had known about before.
Exactly. And also, too, so many issues are resolved by this. It's the peaceful way of resolving these otherwise irreconcilable differences between groups of people. A perfect example is the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war could end tomorrow with one word: plebiscite. In fact, there have been in the Ukraine and the Donbass, in Crimea both, in those two places, two separate plebiscites. The people there want to be ruled by Russia. Okay, it's not like Russia was, Stalin or Hitler moving into violently into territory that didn't want to be conquered. These people, in essence, invited in the rulers that they preferred. So, and these were not, just cliffhanger plebiscites. In all four cases, the two in Crimea and the two in the Donbass, had majorities over 90%, and yet people in the West say, "Oh well, those took place under Russian administration." Yes, that's true, but okay, say there's a 10% error. Okay, you're down to 80, a 20% error. Okay, you're down to. These are enormous majorities that perfectly and peacefully decide this intractable business going on in Ukraine. And in the worldwide media, BBC, CNN, whatever, you never hear once even a whisper of a suggestion that the people want to be ruled by Russia, and they do. So it's a great mystery, and yet secession is not only an American institution, it is, as I just suggested, a proper and peaceful international institution.
And as you say, you're linking it here as the only peaceful ultimate assertion of right to democratic government. That what would it mean to say that, oh yes, this government is going to keep, if this group over here, like you say, if 85% of them vote that, yeah, we would like to break away either to join a different group or just to be our own ruling, have our own jurisdiction, have our own sovereignty. For the original group thing to say, no, we're not letting you do that, and we're going to keep shooting you until you guys change your mind. In what sense could you reconcile that with the principles of democracy? Like that doesn't seem to follow.
Well, okay, that's a very good point, and that brings us to my conclusion that I discuss in the book: the ideal size for a secession. I think you may know that Ludwig von Mises said, if it were practical at all, secession, or self-determination, as he put it in his book, would have to be allowed even to the individual person, which is ridiculous and unmanageable. But he was following strictly a logical conclusion. I conclude, quite to the contrary, that the ideal size is the county. And say, for example, in Crimea or the Donbass, there's this little enclave that doesn't want to be ruled by Russia. That could very well be. So there has to be a provision to allow at least that county-sized group to determine its own form of government. I mentioned that von Mises said there was an unlimited possibility of secession governments, but Thomas Jefferson, in his Ward Republics, allowed for thousands. Basically, for Thomas Jefferson, practically a government existed in your homeowners association, something that small. And there were others who For example, Richard Kreitner and and Woodard proposed that there be 12 seceded governments in the American Union. So, of course, there was the war between the states that was a battle of secession between two governments. So it comes down to what is the ideal size. And relying once again on Don Livingston, he studied carefully the Swiss cantons and throwing out the odd too small or too large cantons, he established that the ideal size was about 250,000 people. So Texas counties are vastly different in size, but you can break up counties just as you break up the 54 to 200 current nations in the international setting to accommodate that ideal size. And that ideal size of about 250,000 people fits nicely into a reasonably sized county. But again, this is not a hard and fast rule. You can't say that, it must be this size and none other. But that seems to be, after these studies done by, also too, Madison as well as Livingston, that the ideal size is about 250,000.
And then going along with that, just for people to understand the implications among all sorts of consequences, would be just the multiplicity of differing jurisdictions and places that people could move to, right? Like if the existing landmass of the U.S. right now was broken up into blocks of roughly 250,000 people each, just think of all the different variety and places people could go to, and then that would keep the people in charge of each jurisdiction from keeping it, I guess, competitive might be the word, or attractive.
Right. Well, for example, it's been pointed out many times, the most successful and democratic states are tiny ones like Liechtenstein, Monaco, Singapore, Hong Kong, at least before the communist takeover. Small is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And here's what it comes down to, Robert. It's basically sovereignty cannot be divided. Hamilton, and I think Federalist 58, made this assertion, and also in other of the Federalist papers, that sovereignty cannot be divided. And I think that is true, because there must be, in every society, a final arbiter of disputes. Whoever that is, or whatever that is, that cannot be split up. And there are examples through history where it's been tried and failed. So it comes down to this. Either there must be a single arbiter of disputes, a single sovereign with a monopoly on the police over a universal geographic extent, from which there is no escape because of the police monopoly, or there must be this diversity of admittedly, possibly unreasonable counties, but offering the possibility of escape. And you look at the societies of the world that are really impossible to live in. For example, you may say, okay, well, we can universalize the American ethic. And George Bush the Younger tried that when he was in office after 2000. And what did that get you? It turned Libya into an enclave of civil war. It empowered the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It let loose a civil war in Syria that sent millions of refugees into Europe, which are in the process of disintegrating Europe. And that's your model democracy, or that was his model of democracy. Well, there are many other alternatives for that. For every one of these examples you can cite, someone else can cite something completely, in your view, quite unreasonable. For example, a Muslim society can say, Well, we want, I don't know, female infant circumcision. We want honor killings. And we want Sharia law. And who's to gainsay them? Who's to gainsay them? And if you wish to gainsay them, then you have immediately cast yourself into the role of an imperial power with universalist deontological pretensions.
So this is interesting. So let me just ask a clarifying question. You're not embracing moral relativism. You're not saying, hey, whatever they do over there, it's right for that. Are you just making more of a practical claim that even if you think that you do have access to the universal absolute truth and this is the way humans should live, for you to try and go enforce that on planet Earth is not going to bode well?
Exactly so. That's an excellent point. What I say is this. I say that there are moral absolutes, but the state is unable to enforce them. Mm-hmm. Any attempt for a state to enforce these absolutes runs afoul of not only those within its community, but those outside its community who make the same pretension, who want to conquer or subdue the one who's made that original claim. So, yes, there are moral absolutes. It's just that the state cannot enforce them.
Okay, and I know we have to get through more, but just to continue this train of thought.
Yeah.
So then, what is one of your answers then for the person who is concerned about these horrendous practices? Say, okay, well, if there really are just groups of there's 250,000 devout Muslims over here, and they do practice those things that we mentioned, but anyone who's in their group right now that doesn't like that stuff, it's relatively easy for them to leave and to go somewhere else, as opposed to the situation when there's a bunch of people living under the USSR and a bunch of people living over under the NATO bloc, and it's harder for you to leave and go somewhere else if the world's grouped into major sides.
Exactly so. And I'm sure that you don't either want to live under the Russian system, and yet the people in the Donbass, for example, or Crimea, are perfectly fine with Putin's authoritarianism and his other pretensions. But let them be.
Folks, let's take a break from the action to talk about today's sponsor, which is Monetary Metals. Now, let me say something before you tune this out. In case you were unaware, if you want to participate with the program at Monetary Metals, you don't need to ship them pre-existing gold and silver that you may already have owned. No, you can just wire them money, and they can go buy the metal on your behalf and then go ahead and enroll it in the program. So I just wanted to clarify to make sure people who don't already own physical gold and silver realize you also can participate in this. So gold prices right now are at an all-time high, but price appreciation isn't the only way to profit. You can earn a yield on gold paid in gold without selling your metal. Unlike dollar yields that can be slashed or even go negative, a yield on gold paid in gold means you're earning more ounces in your account every month, not in paper. Monetary Metals allows you to earn up to 4% on your metal in their gold leasing program, and you start earning that 4% yield immediately upon funding your account. The yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold or silver, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold or silver during the year. Now, you can step outside the dollar system entirely and compound your wealth in a monetary asset that's not a central bank liability. The question's this: why earn in dollars when you can earn in gold? Join thousands of investors, including myself, earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. For more details, go to monetary-metals.com/Murphy. Once again, go to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to see more details. Okay, let's get back to the show. And even there, though, I mean, arguably just consistent with what you're saying is it's not so much perhaps that, oh yeah, in an absolute sense, they like that, but they're saying that's better than this alternative. And if they only have two choices, then, whereas if you had a multiplicity of options, then it might be more nuanced.
Right. The context for this, you probably know, is that elections in the Ukraine were always sharply divided between East and West, with the East going to favoring the Russian authoritarianism and the West wanting to join NATO and so on, which resulted in the United States intervention in the so-called Maidan Revolution of 2014, which created this entire mess where hundreds of thousands of uncommitted Russians and Ukrainian men are being slaughtered for no good reason.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to keep going back to your points, but on that, because you mentioned earlier how the media doesn't cover that. So I realize, folks, Terry here saying some things that to you, if you're not familiar with this, might sound very provocative. And what are you talking about? But again, the point is it's an open question at the very least, whereas, the way a lot of Americans are getting this news, it's just, everyone's just sitting there minding their own business, and Putin just rolls in with a bunch of tanks and starts blowing people up for no reason because he's a monster. And it's way more nuanced than that, for sure.
Amen.
And if you haven't heard the nuance, then that means you're not getting the right information. Maybe you still, would disagree with some of the stuff. But anyway. Okay, your fourth point now is kind of tying some of this together. I claim that the state form of government, pleonastically known as the liberal state, which was created in 1648, must result in totalitarianism, A, because it attempts to enforce a universal set of ethical values, B, because its legitimacy is based in majoritarian electoral politics, and C, because it denies the right to secession. So that's what I meant, that this one kind of draws the earlier threads together and packs a punch there. So do you want to just talk about that?
Right. I think the best way to talk about it is to make probably a bolder claim in saying that it is impossible for any government to make moral distributions. A government, whatever it may be, makes this universalist, at least for its geographic extent, universalist claim that it can distribute the goods of society in a way that enhances the well-being of the majority, at least in those democratic countries. Of course, we know how that really works. The political pie is divided quite arbitrarily and in favor of the ones who are doing the dividing. But it's really a distinction deeper than that. I say that it's impossible for any government to make moral distinctions because moral distributions, because for example, you give your money to a government, and once you do that, it loses will and intention. Will and intention are absolutely essential for any moral act. Take a simpler example. A Boy Scout is walking an old lady across the street. He does so voluntarily. That is a moral act. Now, you can ask yourself, that same Boy Scout, if there were a gun placed to his head to walk the old lady across the street, would that still be a moral act? No, it would not, because it lacks the will and intention of the one performing the action. So you can say, okay, well, I'm going to pay my taxes. I'm going to support this government because it has, the Biden platform. And I want the Biden platform to succeed. So I'm giving my money to it. Well, that cannot be a moral act. First of all, your money contributed by taxes or even voluntarily goes into a general fund. Everybody knows that a political platform is entirely expedient. Some things get done and some things don't. And some things get done that are not even on the platform. And Bob Dole famously said, when he was confronted about the Republican platform, said, I don't even read it. I've never read the platform. Like he didn't even care. So anyway, you give your money to this government in the hopes that it will realize this vague platform, but your money is completely subtracted from its moral impulse. It lacks will and intention. So your money may go to buy, I give this example in my book, food to feed the hungry, or it may go buy a bunker buster bomb for the Israeli army. How do you know? What happened to your money once it entered that great pot of federalist expenditure? You don't know what happened to it. So you may say, okay, well, all right, that will intention may be stripped off by the very fact of the money going into a general fund, and yet the government might very well provide meals for the hungry or something like that. Well, it might very well do something entirely different, and typically it does. Typically, government is notorious for the unintended consequences of things that were meant wholesomely at the beginning, but invariably or almost invariably turn out wrong. So would you agree, Robert, here I'll put you on the spot, that it's impossible for a government to make moral distributions?
Yes. Yeah. For the way what you mean by those terms. Yes, I agree with that. And that, I mean, one thing that I do on that notion too is just talking to people who haven't really delved deep into political philosophy and things, and they just recoil and say, oh, come on, there's certain things that are very uncontroversial, like, having some food banks, soup kitchens and things. So people literally, and so, right, I agree with you. And so if it's the case that the overwhelming majority have no problem and don't object to their money being used to that, well, then we don't need to force them at gunpoint, right? So it's this weird tension where they say, oh, no, we have to have the government do it, otherwise everyone's going to starve, and don't get mad at us, quote, coercing you because everybody's fine with this. And so it seems like a weird tension.
And the terrible thing about all this is that the government puffs itself up with these great moral pretensions, saying that it's doing, the will of the people. It's saving democracy and this and that, when that may be an accidental consequence occasionally in their expenditures, but it's not a morally intended consequence. It can't be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we push ahead to the fifth claim? I claim that democratic principles can only be realized in a claristocratic, and that's K-L-E-R-I-S-T, ocratic, government inspired by the symbiotic and subsidiarity principles of Johannes Althusius, who's from 1563 to 1638. So a lot of vocabulary there to unpack. Take it away.
Okay. Well, okay. Claristocratic. Kleros, that just comes from the Greek word kleros, which means choice by lot, random lot.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, as I detail in the book, and I can't go into the details here, it take us some time, that this error in the current application of choice by random lot relies on stratification, which is completely arbitrary and always skewed to the left. So the insistence on on a random selection of government officials is this: only through sortition can you annihilate politics. That's the only way. There are dozens and dozens of ways of been proposed. William Poundstone wrote a book on dozens of ways that the democratic electoral process has been tweaked. What is it? There's so many different choices that it's impossible to name them all, trying to fix the business of a broken democratic system. And typically, especially in our case, in America, well, first of all, you can't escape the iron law of oligarchy. That's Robert Michel's. He's from the 19th century. Robert Michel's a German philosopher, political philosopher, said you cannot escape the iron oligarchy. And that is, once any organization, especially in government, gets to a certain size, there has to be an elite at the top just because of tactical and technical necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to promote this kind of political machine that we have now. And worst of all, in places like the United States, where we have a first past the post, that is total majoritarian electoral system, that always devolves according to Duverger's law. Duverger's law says that you're going to have in a first past the post majoritarian electoral system that doesn't have second round voting, a tendency to be a two-party system. So all of these tweaks and fixes and so on, they don't, no matter what they are, you've still got politics. And the only way to get rid of politics is through the annihilation of voting. That can only happen through kleristocracy or sortition of some kind. But it has to be a sortition that does not use demographics. So
can I stop you for a second, Terry? Are you familiar from, it's economics broadly, but the specific field is called social choice theory and what's called Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem?
Yes, impossibility theory. Yes, indeed.
Okay, because for the folks at home, and I'll put a link because this is a thing that you can prove it without relying on a lot of high-powered math. So I would pick this when I would teach game theory to undergrads because I could actually show them the proof. But for people home, Kenneth Arrow, he was trying to come up with like, oh yeah, you got a bunch of people with preferences, ordinal rankings over various outcomes of the world, and then you want to come up with a rule that generates a social welfare function to map from the groups, the individual's preferences to what the group wants. And he came up with some very obvious criteria that you would want, like there's no one person who's a dictator, right? So that the social welfare function doesn't merely say individual J always gets his way, right? Things like that. If every single person thinks A is better than B, then the social welfare function better think that too. Stuff like that. And then when he was done, this is the way the story goes. He was just trying to weed out the obvious silly ones to then focus on the viable candidates. And he ended up with the empty set that he just proved, oh wait, there is no function that satisfies all of these blatantly obvious, and you would think, so all the economists then said, oh, so I guess we're going to give up on democracy. No, they just said, that's really interesting. And they just kept going on as if nothing happened.
Right. Well, the kernel idea that I took from the Kenneth Arrow impossibility theorem is that there's no way to ensure that a scenario where the process is not gamed. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to make the system ungameable.
Yeah. Okay. So what then? So what did Johannes Althusius himself? Was it literally just the idea of like keep it small is beautiful, and how do you administer it within the smaller jurisdictions is by randomization, or is that too glib of a way to summarize it?
No, he didn't have the business of sortition or random selection, but his principal idea is that of subsidiarity, which states that the smallest, most local administrative unit must be assigned to perform any government function. And the reason for that is that you have these enveloping power structures if that is not preserved. And an important corollary to that idea of subsidiarity is that it cannot work unless you have secession. That is to say, if the smallest unit is the most efficient and most, how would you say it? We'll just leave it at that. It's the most efficient system for administering some government function, whether it's repairing potholes or feeding school children, although that shouldn't be a government function, either one actually. But the only way that the smaller unit can preserve its identity is to have the possibility of secession. So if you were to say, for example, okay, I endorse subsidiarity, that's great, and the smallest unit is going to be typically the most efficient and locally administered and locally controlled, but they can't bail out if a larger unit overrules it.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, your notion of subsidiarity is worthless unless that smaller unit has the possibility to secede.
Yeah. Okay, this is going to come out of left field here, Terry, but going through your manuscript, I have to ask, and this is relevant because I do a lot of, econ stuff, a lot of political science, anarcho-capitalism, things like that, but then also a lot of biblical commentary looking at the different schools of thought there too. And so you got something on your page 11 here that struck me, is you said you're talking about Eric Nelson's 2019 work, The Theology of Liberalism, and you say the gist of the work is that the founders of classical liberalism were Pelagians. So, folks, that's Pelagians, some explicitly so, who rejected Augustinian original sin. Can you just expound on that? Because that was fascinating to me.
Yes. I recommend that book to everybody, The Theology of Liberalism by Eric Nelson. And, well, first of all, just to define it, Pelagianism rejected, just to put it in a nutshell, rejected original sin. And this was a live option, the ability to reject this notion up until the time of Augustine. So, and also too, was never decided until an ecumenical council. But up until that, the ecumenical council of 410, the Catholic Church said, well, you don't need to be a good Catholic, you don't need to observe original sin. And these Enlightenment thinkers, starting, there are quite a few of them, John Milton, Leibniz, others that I can't think of right now. Immanuel Kant, John Locke. Those were Pelagians who said that original sin prevents moral choice. So this gets us into hot water with the Augustinians. But if you say that, if you strictly enforce original sin, you're up against, I think, what is the absolute last word devastation of original sin by Ayn Rand, by little Alice Rosenbaum. She said that if we are tainted with Adam's sin, that Adam in the Garden of Eden was nothing more than a robot. He had no reason. He had no moral choice. He had no sense of productive activity, and he had no sense of sexual joy. All of that condemnation, all of those robotic characteristics is what you want when you endorse original sin. And John Rawls, who we didn't get a chance to discuss, became an atheist in 1945 because of his inability to reconcile to God with original sin. So I think, well, just to put it into a nutshell, these philosophers, these political philosophers in the 16th, 17th century, the beginning of the Enlightenment, founded liberalism on this Pelagian belief that rejected original sin.
Okay, yeah. So the reason that struck me is because, like, I had never thought of that connection, but there is a certain symmetry there that, you know, the Enlightenment classical liberal, like the old school, especially before seeing the ravages of the 20th century and this idea of, you know, oh, the perfectibility of man, if you just get the landed aristocracy out of the way, or the whatever, that the people will naturally be led to do the right thing, at least over time as they learn from their mistakes, and what, as opposed to a more cynical, like, no, you're born a wretched sinner, and unless God just grabs you, you're not, you know, like a Calvinistic approach. So anyway, it's interesting to see the different ways that would play out, and how that would, you know, your view on something metaphysical would then spill down into the practical, you know, politics. Okay. So, just moving along here. So maybe one element is, obviously you're in favor of Texas secession, at least broadly defined. Are you, maybe the way to motivate, like, your approach, you know, for my listeners, because they, you know, they know my stuff. I've had other Texas, you know, Texit people on my show. So is there something that, like, you're saying that your framework, you know, gives that the other people, like, they're, you know, we're barking up the wrong tree, or there's some big thing we're missing that we need to know?
A little bit. The main fear that I have of the Texas people, and I'm a member of the Texas Nationalist Movement, TNM, led by Daniel Miller.
Yeah, I've had him on the show. I don't know if you know that, but yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. But my fear is that Texas succeeds, and I think it's inevitable that Texas does secede, because, as I've said, we're in the throes of the breakup of the form of state government that we inherited from the Westphalian Treaty of 1648. My fear is that Texas secedes, and it tries to recreate the very thing in it that it emerged from.
Right.
So, in other words, in fact, that's been raised as a complaint against Daniel Miller, that, you know, okay, you're seceding to form what? You're just going to give us a miniature version of the same problems.
Right.
And
if I could just stop here, and the way I put it is to say, like, because people say, we need to go back to the Constitution, and say, look at how great the founding fathers were. Like, look at our statesmen today compared to, you know, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and you're saying we're going to do it like them, but we're going to get it better this time. Like, there's, like, in other words, if what they did ultimately failed, and that's why we are where we are today, then why would you think with our people we could try it again, but this time we'll get it right? If you're doing the same approach,
right? But even a brilliant man like Alexander Hamilton was something of a cynic. He said that the Constitution is a, quote, frail and worthless fabric. And he put that belief into practice. 2 years after the signing of the Constitution, he had given us a Federal Reserve System, or a national bank, that is, Federal Reserve System. So, and also, too, he wanted, you know, a kind of a plenipotentiary president with the power to dismiss state governors. So, but even if you had neglected that and said, well, let's go full Madison federalism. Well, it didn't work out. And it turns out that Abraham Lincoln, whatever you may think of his righteousness or the war between the states, concocted an entirely new government with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment without changing a letter in the Constitution written by the founding fathers. So, yeah, you can go back and have this desire to top that, to top the founding fathers, and yet without a purpose, without a system to guide this, what happens after the exit, then you're back on the same beaten path to the breakup we have now.
Okay, and then maybe the flip side, because again, as I think you know, Terry, like, I'm have written a lot on what's called anarcho-capitalism. I saw you use that expression in your manuscript, so you're familiar with the term. So why are the Rothbardian ANCAPs? What are they missing? Because I gather from some of your remarks here that you don't endorse the Rothbardian vision of a totally decentralized private property society where there's no politics at all, and that's how we solve this problem. Everything's just voluntary contracts between different. The individual is sovereign.
Right. Here it is in a nutshell, Robert, and that is the central failing of all libertarians. They believe that the entire architecture of a free society can be constructed from contracts. Mm-hmm. That's just impossible. And they also start with the ZAP or the NAP, the
non-aggression principle. Yep.
Or the zero aggression principle, whichever way you want to call it. The thing is that libertarians stand on that like they've created a whole new universe. And in fact, it's full of holes. For example, okay, is someone aggressive who comes up to you in a public restaurant and starts screaming obscenities in your face? Is that aggression? And so the real problem was pointed out by a guy named Julian Sanchez. And he wrote an article called "The Non-Aggression Principle Can't Be Salvaged." And his whole point was that the principle tends to mask underlying rights issues. It's really not about aggression. And David Friedman, whose Substack I read religiously, gave this example of someone who lives a mile away, who turns on a laser and shines it into your bedroom window. Okay, is that aggressive? In what way is the state empowered to overcome that aggression? And also, this is absolutely devastating for the libertarians who begin with the non-aggression principle. He says that enforcing contracts, which is their whole architecture, is or is not the initiation of force. If enforcement of contracts is an initiation of force, then no libertarian government can do it. Mm-hmm. If it's not an initiation of force, then other people can do it. And if you try to prevent them from doing it, then you are initiating force. So in other words, this whole business from Nozick, who supposes that you can start with a protective agency that grows to become a minimalist state, in which evolves into a non-growing liberal democracy, is just absolute nonsense. You are stuck, based on what Friedman just pronounced, with a multiplicity of contending protective agencies. You can't get out of it.
Well, right. So, I mean, I agree that that's where you have to end up, but isn't that the anarcho-capitalist vision? Yeah, there is no Supreme Court. There is no, just like in physics or chemistry, there's no one group that's in charge, and that's the vision, right?
Well, that whole train of thought was pursued by Nozick, and it didn't work. Murray Rothbard's critique of Anarchy, State, and Utopia was that the claims made for a minimalist state are the same arguments made for a totalitarian state. In other words, basically, part two of Anarchy, State, and Utopia was to prove that this minimalist state would not grow, and yet there's no logical reason for it not growing. So probably the best stab at creating a libertarian minimalist state was made by Nozick, and really it it failed. His whole, I think his central point of failure, if not the one pointed out by Rothbard, was that he has to transition from this protectionist society that becomes a minimalist state in a moral way that allows it to enforce these universal rules. And that's where he fails, because he says, and I have the quote here from Nozick's book. He says that people in his minimalist state have a right to demand, quote, similar acquiescence on the part of those who have benefited from their submission to this large protective agency. Well, no, they don't. No, they don't have the right. And so you can just stop reading right there on page 90 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, because that is the logical sequence that he tries to put forth to build this minimalist state.
Yeah, just to avoid confusion for everybody, I agree with you that Nozick's project fails, but he was showing why you start out with anarchy and like a Rothbardian system, and it leads up to a minimal state, and Rothbard and others said, wait, no, that doesn't work. So I agree that Nozick didn't justify the state the way he tried to do it. Okay, maybe the last thing here, well, I got you, Terry, is people might wonder, okay, so what do we do next? And so I'm looking at my version here, page 257. You say, as a peaceful movement, secession can only advance through a campaign of education, can only succeed with the acceptance of the following truth by a great majority of citizens. I'll just summarize some of that. You got 1, 2, 3,
Sure.
4, 5. You say the state cannot be the moral representative of its citizens. No policy is perfect because of its moral pretense of representing the general will. The state makes the preposterous demand that private challengers perfectly satisfy every individual, while the state claims perfect representation of the general will. Another point that you say everyone needs to realize, or the great majority needs to realize, is elections are oligarchic, sortition is democratic. The smaller community where choices are made collectively, the smaller will be the probability that any individual's preference gets overruled. And markets provide more goods tailored to individual needs than the state does. And finally, no individual right gives you a claim on others. No one and no government owes you anything. So is it correct to say you think what needs to happen for people who agree with your worldview is we got to spread the word on those bullet points and get that out?
Well, yes, and I think that the greatest success in doing that has happened in Texas. And Texas has all these natural advantages that no other state has. It has its own electrical grid, it has its own deep water ports, it has its own bullion depository. And in fact, a bill is recently under discussion to make gold from that depository legal tender. Mm-hmm. So it has all of these enormous advantages and also there's this something that must not be forgotten, this spirit of independence that the Texans have cherished since their founding in 1836. All those things make Texas the best spot to promulgate that list that you just read.
Okay, well, that's a great place to wrap up. So, folks, my guest has been Terry, or T.L. Hulsey, who wrote The Constitution of Non-State Government, Field Guide to Texas Secession, which is now in its second edition. Terry, thanks for writing the book and joining us today and discussing these important topics.
Thanks, Robert, for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.